Thank you very much. Thank you to Anthony and to the philosopher for the invitation, and of course to Gregg for writing the book and for agreeing to participate. I think I was a good choice simply in the sense that clearly there is an obvious disagreement. So that's what you're gonna get. But I want to start by while not denying that there is a strong disagreement between Gregg's views and mine, there is a strong and I think crucial point of agreement. So I'll mention it first and I'll come back to it either in discussion or at the end of my comments. We both, Gregg and I, agree that most criminal justice systems, or at least the one with which I assume we are most familiar, which is the one in the US, is extraordinarily dysfunctional, and it is extraordinarily cruel, and it does all sorts of awful things to people, supposedly to wrongdoers, but to people who are not wrongdoers and to people who are not even suspected of being wrongdoers. So I think that part of Gregg's motivation is to reject retributivism. I'll say something in a second about it. To reject retributivism because he thinks that retributivism is to blame for the things that we agree are very bad with the criminal justice system. The main point of disagreement is that I don't think retributivism is at fault here. So Gregg's book is wide-ranging, is ambitious, is a passionate book, is an important book. But I think that the book in many ways, or in some ways that I would like to highlight, demonizes retributivism. It turns it into something different from what I understand. I'm very grateful that Gregg refers to my version of retributivism as some sort of moderate retributivism. But I think, I mean, he rejects it too. Gregg's position is not merely that he is a determinist, which very roughly I'm going to define as the view that everything that happens in the world, including all our decisions, is explicable through science and it's predetermined and there is no real free will. But more importantly, it's not just that everything is predetermined, but that any of the widespread compatibilist approaches, I'll define it in a second, are to be rejected. In other words, Gregg is both a determinist and anti-compatibilist. Now, a compatibilist, I'm trying to avoid technicalities, is someone like me who believes whether or not, or rather, regardless of how the free will determinism debate gets resolved, regardless of the truth of one or the other positions, for our practical purposes, we could bracket out that discussion. And in fact, in most of my career, I have bracketed out. Part of Gregg's point is that it shouldn't be bracketed out, because if he's right, then positions such as mine really have no foundation. But the compatibilist, which is, if not the majority of the philosophers, is at least half of the philosophers, roughly half, and roughly half of the punishment theories, they assume, okay, I could put that problem to the side and then focus on how life goes as we live it. So I want to very quickly go through a few points that I think get perhaps lost in the picture of what I am describing as Gregg's perhaps demonizing retributivism. The first thing Gregg does is to highlight how important retributivism is in the US. And he cites one judge. He has some references for this claim. But I think that this already is, I want to say tendentious, is problematic for the following reason. Over 97% of trials in the United States are resolved via something called plea bargaining. A plea bargaining agreement is not even pretending to care about the cert. These are completely consequentialist rationales. So even if Gregg were right about everything he's saying, that would apply to only, to only 3% of all cases. So from my perspective, since I am not a friend of plea bargaining, and we have, as a practical matter, embraced that system because we have an overgrown and just a dysfunctional criminal justice system, we couldn't afford not to have it. But instead of fixing the system and refusing to criminalize as much as we do and to punish as severely as we do, we then come up with this sort of fix, which is it's not even trying to give people what they deserve. It's not official. It's irrelevant.
That's part of the problem.
Correct. So from my perspective, if the system were more retributivist, then we wouldn't have plea bargaining and so on and so forth. Now, I guess I should say very well. So let me say that's one area in which I think things are presented in a peculiar way. Now, to part of the reason why I think Gregg can, I was going to say get away with that, but let me put it, can say that, is that there is also a kind of colloquial sense of retributivism and similar language that has been employed by political figures, I mean, candidates and so on and so forth. So for example, they claim to be retributivist because they have a tough on crime stance or something along those lines. It's a very common political platform, but that is quite independent from philosophical, or call it scholarly retributivism. For whatever it's worth, I am not tough on crime. I don't like that political agenda. I have opposed it in writing, which is the only way in which I could oppose anything, publicly, and yet I am a retributivist. What does it mean to be a retributivist? In my sense, it means to say that the fact that people deserve punishment matters. Now, here already there's a point, I mean, I want to avoid the technicalities, but there is a classical way of distinguishing between versions of retributivism, whereby you could be, let's say, a weak retributivist if you simply claim that the fact that someone deserves the punishment gives you the permission, the right to punish that person. But there's a more, let's say, a strong version of it, whereby the fact that someone deserves it gives you an obligation to inflict it. I disagree with the latter. I don't think that that's correct, but I much more fundamentally disagree with that way of approaching the problem. And I have argued against this talk of rights and duties in this context in the following sense. A proper understanding of retributivism should simply say that the fact that someone deserves punishment matters. It doesn't give you merely a right. It certainly doesn't give you a duty. It's not merely a necessary condition. It's not a full-blown sufficient conditions. Gregg he replaces this bipartite distinction with a tripartite distinction, or he follows a tripartite distinction. But very soon after he introduces it, he abandons it, and then he moves on to discussing what he thinks is the essence of the more, what's the word? Ambitious form of retributivism, the one that wants you to, as he put it, sorry, I'm perfectly happy to stop, Gregg, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, all right. So let's just all right. So the retributivist view for me maintains that absent any excusing conditions, mental health issues, exculpatory kinds of reasoning, wrongdoers morally deserve to be punished. Yeah, there's a distinction between weak, strong, or moderate and strong forms of retributivism, and I say that I'm dealing with moderate and strong versions. Weak versions are, even for most retributivists, not really retributivism. It's kind of consequentialist, constrained by like a negative desert claim. Your view is within the realm of views I'm criticizing, because the moderate view sticks to this kind of core belief, right? So the idea for me is that the fundamental features about retributivism is that it's grounded in a notion of deserve. And I mean, you might disagree with the purely backward-looking aspect because you prefer a sort of different sort of way of framing it, but that the desert of wrongdoers is sufficient to justify punishment. It doesn't require it. There might be overriding values as to why we shouldn't give wrongdoers what they truly deserve, but it justifies it in that it provides a sufficient kind of justification for that punishment. In the book, I lay out 6 distinct arguments against retributivism, right? And then I propose my alternative approach, the public health quarantine model. Only 2 of my objections against retributivism depend upon the free will issue. It's my skepticism and my epistemic argument. And then there's four distinct sort of arguments that are independent of concerns about free will and basic desert. Very quickly, I define free will as the control and action that's required for basic desert moral responsibility, i.e. the kind of moral responsibility that would make agents truly deserving of praise or blame, punishment, and reward. So if we were to lack this kind of free will, then we would lack the kind of desert that's exactly the kind of desert that's required to justify retributivism. And that's why I think free will matters. To say a couple things in response to what you've already said, I would say that in the book, I cite all kinds of ways in which the law appeals to retributive and desert-based justifications of punishment. In particular, the revision of the model penal code doubles down recently on retributivism as the primary justification. The Supreme Court rules that it's the only justification for the death penalty. There's all kinds of different state provisions in the criminal codes of individual states in the purpose sections where desert plays the primary kind of motivation. The issue of 90% or more of people plea bargaining, I actually raise an objection to desert because in a system of criminal justice where you're supposed to distribute punishment in accordance with desert, one of the problems is that I argue is it's practically impossible, regardless of issues of free will, given the volume of cases that come through the system and the fact that 90% of them are adjudicated by plea bargaining. Shows that desert has nothing to do, is not playing any role at all. That's a problem for the retributivist, in part because the retributivist program is, I would argue, practically impossible to implement in any kind of fair way. Again, there's separate issues here. I mean, there's the free will issue, and then there's these other practical concerns. I could get into each of the individual arguments I have for why the system really can't, and why I don't think the proper role of the state should be to distribute punishment in accordance with desert. And there's good philosophical reasons for saying that. I will say this, that I think it's a big mistake for legal scholars like yourself, like Stephen Morse, another one who thinks compatibilism is sufficient for the law, in sidestepping the issue of free will. You, I think in your book, dedicate one footnote to it and sort of just brush it aside. And Stephen Morse sort of does this thing where he says, well, what is a folk, lawyer like myself supposed to do? And so I'm just going to assume kind of compatibilism. And I raise all kinds of reasons for why that is a bad move, particularly because the retributive justification is predicated on the notion of blameworthiness and desert. If agents aren't blameworthy in this fundamental sense, in this philosophically relevant sense, then the justification for retributivism is unfounded. And to the extent that we want our legal practices to be justified, I think it's ill-advised. And so let me just quickly say, I have my arguments for free will skepticism. I've been pushing them for a couple decades now. And in the book, I lay out my reasons for being a free will skeptic. I will correct you on the issue that I'm a determinist because I'm officially agnostic about the truth of determinism. I'm a hard incompatibilist who argues that free will would be incompatible with either the truth of determinism or indeterminism. But I also have a second argument against free will based on luck. So I also, what Neil Levy calls a hard luck advocate, which argues that the pervasiveness of luck also undermines free will and basic desert moral responsibility. If my arguments, so free will skeptics like myself maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, whether that be determinism, indeterminism, or luck. And because of this, we're never morally responsible in the basic desert sense, exactly the sense required for to justify retributive punishment. I have a second, slightly weaker form of skepticism in the book, which I call the epistemic argument. And maybe we could start the conversation there. The epistemic argument goes something like this, right? Let's say you're not persuaded by my arguments against free will. And I don't think it's enough to just say there are many people who are compatibilists. I think you need to give the burden of proof is on. So here's how the epistemic argument works. The epistemic argument is meant to shift the burden of proof to the retributivist in this way. So I think we agree on this. Legal punishment entails intentionally inflicting harm on wrongdoers. And in fact, in the way the criminal justice system, well, punishment in itself, the definition I developed is a widely, okay, so
Could I
harsh treatment, right?
could I
So
interject there?
yeah, go ahead.
So I agree with part of what you're going to say, but in fact, I do object to your using the word harm. That already stacks the deck against the retributivism.
No, no, it's not. This is definition
let me
of
finish.
punishment independent of retributivism.
No, I understand, but I would like to finish my sentence. I don't know if there's a audio problem, so let me just say this. The standard definition of punishment in the literature, many call it the standard definition of punishment, is the Flew-Ben-Hart definition. The word harm doesn't appear there. It's called Flew-Ben-Hart because those three scholars independently develop it. What is true of punishment is that it seeks to inflict something bad on the person, something unwanted, but harm has different connotations. And then you basically expanded on Michael Zimmerman's very nice book, a book called The Immorality of Punishment, or sorry, The Immorality of, I forgot if it is of punishment or of retributivism, but there's nothing wrong with doing that. You said you preferred that definition. You didn't explain why exactly you didn't choose these. You could have explained why it's better than the standard one, but I don't think that this would affect the central point that you want to make.
Yeah, so
the central point is that there's something bad that we're doing to people or something they don't want done onto them. I would call it a harm. Yeah.
Well, we could debate this, right? So I do think that it's not just Zimmerman's definition, it's David Boonin's definition. It's, many legal scholars who've actually defined punishment in terms of certain necessary conditions. And so one of them for me is that it involves an intentional imposition, if you want to call it harsh treatment, that's Hart's kind of way of phrasing it, right? It has to be intentional. Because if I trip and knock over an elderly person and cause them harm, that's not punishment, right? It has to be intentional. It has to be done with someone who has the authority to punish, either a parent or in the case of legal punishment, the state. It usually has a communicative component, condemning both the act and the wrongdoer. And so it has to have certain essential features, otherwise it's not punishment. And so my argument, the epistemic argument, is that legal punishment inflicts a great deal of harm on individuals, whether it's the loss of liberty, the separation of loved ones from their family members, deprivation, loss of rights. It causes a great deal of harm, especially when you're talking about imprisonment. If one's going to intentionally harm wrongdoers, if one's going to intentionally impose harm on an individual, they have to have good prima facie reason or justification for doing so. And I argue that that means they have to reach a high epistemic bar, that they have to have good justification or good warrant for thinking that harming this individual or imposing harsh treatment on this individual, taking away their liberty, however you want to frame it, is justified, right? So then the second premise is that, look, if there's sufficient, if it's significantly probable that one justification for harming another is unsound, then it's prima facie morally wrong. The retributivist justification for legal punishment is predicated on the notion that individuals are free and morally responsible and therefore deserve some form of harsh treatment because they've knowingly done wrong. And then the third premise is essentially that the retributivist assumption is not warranted. It doesn't reach the high epistemic bar that's needed to justify intentionally inflicting harsh treatment or punishment or deprivation on individuals. And that's because, and I think you acknowledge this, the debate about free will is waged for over 2,000 years. There's no clear consensus. There are good, sound, powerful objections to libertarian accounts of free will, and there are good, sound, powerful objections to compatibilist accounts of free will, i.e. the kind of accounts that would be needed to justify or ground the idea that individuals are morally responsible in the required sense. Because of this because of this doubt, and I'm not talking about my bold skepticism, which is that we have basically the only rational position to adopt is the skeptical position. This only requires a kind of level of doubt about whether or not any of the other accounts succeed. And because there's a sufficient doubt present, I argued that we should resist adopting retributive legal punishment because We don't have the epistemic justification for thinking individuals have the kind of a desert. And so it shifts the burden of proof. For
Okay, could I then respond
finish
to this?
it? Let me just finish it. For those retributivists who just want to, sweep aside the problem of free will, they're completely overlooking this epistemic argument and this challenge, which is a burden of proof challenge. And my argument in the book is that the proper epistemic bar to adopt is a really high one, beyond reasonable doubt. In fact, it's the legal standard we use for criminal guilt. And I don't think you would even acknowledge that we come anywhere near that bar. So I think that unless you have another way of responding to these kind of concerns, that one argument in itself is a problem, let alone the the 5 others. Yeah.
Sure. So I mean, I had more to say about, but there's very brief time, so I'll take this issue that you brought up. So let me begin. One problem that I have with your call for epistemic humility is that it's intermittently on display on your book. For some things you are, you call for us to be humble epistemically, but for others do not. You even refer yourself, there are several passages in the book in which you claim that the only reasonable position to have is yours. I quoted in my review of and you admit that the debate has been raging for thousands of years, and still the only reasonable position is yours. That doesn't strike me as very.
Well, look, I'm giving you.
But let me
one
continue.
is the skeptical argument.
Yeah, let me continue to the other part of your point. So just as a premise, let us suppose that I'm wrong and that you are not cherry picking when you are epistemically humble and when you're not. The very argument that you described, that you presented, has been presented before, and this is going to sound awful. I apologize to the audience and to you, Greg, but I have discussed it before. The exact argument about burden of proof was presented by Hyman Gross a few years. I responded to it. By Luis Chiesa a few years, I responded to it. It is virtually identical to your argument. And what my response has been is the following. There is a big difference between adjudicating guilt or innocence in a court of law and adjudicating the true or the falsity or the merits or the propriety of a philosophical doctrine or any doctrine otherwise. The example that I have used is there are serious doubts as to what is the best procedure for combating inflation in economic terms. There are huge doubts as to what is the right procedure for correcting inguinal hernias. There are huge doubts in these areas, and inguinal hernias are, of course, treated and
but look,
but Greg, let me just finish. So the analogy just doesn't work. I want to say something even in this point.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
All right, so I think that there's a big difference between other areas of philosophical disputes. Like we're debating, the abstract nature of numbers or the difference between realism or anti-realism. I don't think necessarily one needs to have their position reach the level of, beyond reasonable doubt. I do think it's a different case when the primary justification that's being given for legal punishment is a retributive one, and where the retributive justification presumes or assumes that individuals have exactly the kind of desert that's under dispute in this very famous, very long, extended debate over free will. To continue to engage in retributive practices, given the lack of epistemic certainty or even clarity about the issue of free will, to me is equivalent to moral malpractice.
All right. So let me just, if I may. I thought you were going to go slightly differently now, and I thought we were going to agree, but maybe we do agree in what I was going to say, which is there is something significant about the spirit of the position that you're defending in this moment, and something with which I would agree, which is in this case, as opposed to the hernia treatment or the inflation treatment, we are causing suffering to people. And causing suffering, and that makes a difference. And yes, so if I could finish the thought, that says to me that we should be circumspect when we punish, that we should not be, let's call it, trigger happy when we punish. And that's why, in part, we can agree so much. If we were discussing policy issues, the two of us, as to what should happen in terms of the criminal justice system in the US, I suspect that we will have many agreements. I suspect that. The reason is that one should be super careful about punishing people, but that doesn't save your argument from the criticism that I presented. The mere fact that doubts surround a certain position or a certain theory does not show that we should have the same standard as we would do in a court of law when determining guilt or innocence. So that problem is different from this one, and the spirit behind you, as I said, is something I may agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, okay, two things. One, yes, there's a huge difference between intentional harm and foreseeable harm. And I argue that the bar has to be higher for intentional harm. And in many of these other cases, right? So let's, my quarantine analogy, right? When we quarantine individuals, we're depriving them of liberty, but there's a difference between quarantine and punishment. By no intuitive definition do we punish somebody who has Ebola, even though you're depriving them of their liberty. It's a foreseeable kind of harm, but it's not an intended harm. It doesn't also have the communicative component of punishment and the condemnatory aspects, et cetera. I think you're still sidestepping the power of the epistemic argument, though, because I think the idea is that, well, the burden then is on the retributivist because it is involved in intentional harsh treatment. Secondly, I also think that the difference between other forms of punishment, like consequentialist, communicative, educational theories of punishment, which are forward-looking, or at least they're not grounded in the notion of desert. Well, yeah, maybe we should be suspect and limited in our application of those forms of punishment for all the kind of reasons you give about values of forgiveness and mercy. But the fact that you still believe that the retributive principle that wrongdoers should be punished in accordance with their desert is still assuming a huge philosophical nugget and a big one, and the one that is doing all of the justificatory work in terms of justifying the legal practice of punishment, of institutional state punishment. And
could I try to?
Yeah, I mean, given, I think the burden of proof then is on the person who is assuming desert, not on the person who's rejecting desert. The default position should be that we reject retributive justifications of punishment on the off chance that the compatibilists are wrong and the libertarian accounts are wrong. So I'll pause there. I mean, but I also want to say that beyond the free will issue, there are many other problems, I think, with the problem with distributing the state distributing punishment in accordance with desert. But go ahead.
So one thing I want to say is that given my account of retributivism, all that commits me to is to valuing people getting what they deserve, in this case, suffering or punishment. I can be, and in my book, I am explicitly a pluralist. Yeah, there are many things which are important when it comes to the justification of punishment. As a matter of political philosophy or political theory, I may be very willing to concede that the desert of the wrongdoer occupies not a primordial place. However, what I reject as vehemently as I can is the idea that the notion of desert ought to matter not at all. And that is exactly your view. And your view forces you to be a monist. You have, what I mean by that is the following.
I know you. Yeah.
So you of course you could describe many different things that could be accomplished by your quarantine.
Well, the reason I want to eradicate the reason I want to eradicate desert completely is because I think it's unjustified. You've given me no reason. Let me then continue with thus far to think it is justified.
Yeah, sure. Let me. I don't know why. Maybe there's some audio problem. I apologize. The other point I want to make with this last remark you made is a leitmotif in the book, and it is this: some critics of the anti-compatibilist position, such as the one that you have claimed that it is in fact impossible to live this way. to
I
believe.
don't say that. That's not
I
my
mean,
view.
but
Yeah.
right now there was no. I mean, just beginning to make a point. Let me finish it, then you could go. Some thinkers believe that. They could be wrong for all I know. I would have liked more engagement with their views. One form of criticism to the sort of position that you embrace is that, let's call it, I mean, I'm following Pamela Geronimi on her recent book on Strawson's Freedom and Resentment. It is impossible for you to criticize a practice from within the practice. You deny that people have moral responsibility in the basic desert sense. That's your view. By the way, that applies across the board. You are not limited to the criminal justice system. You believe this doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But the reasons why you want the policies that you want in place is because you believe that the other position somehow is unfair. It violates people's autonomy. And then these are, you cannot, my suggestion is you cannot have it both ways. You cannot cast such a immense doubt on morality as we know it, and at the same time appeal to it or smuggle it back when you say, okay, listen, look what these retributivists have accomplished, all this awful stuff, awful morally. So either there is morality and there is moral responsibility, or there is.
All right, Leo, I think you need to be far more careful in parsing various things. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the free will debate. So anyway, I spend a good deal of the book addressing compatibilism. You haven't really given me any responses to the manipulation argument, the luck pincer, all the various reasons for rejecting compatibilism. You haven't addressed any of those. Second, adopting the skeptical perspective on basic desert, in my argument, does not mean morality can't be preserved, axiological judgments about right and wrong, good and bad. On my account, certain types of moral exchanges are still justified. On my account, yes, I do think you could even preserve certain deontological notions like respect for persons. I give very spelled out, very particular arguments for each of those views. So I think it's a painting with a broad brush, and it's a straw man version of the skeptical view to think that but with the rejection of basic desert goes all of morality, all the axiological judgments, all kinds of moral exchanges. And also, I give you very particular reasons for why I think the safety protections that I preserve in the book can be preserved within the skeptical perspective. I spend a lot of time talking about Strawson, both in this book and elsewhere. And yes, I disagree with Strawson vehemently, because I think part of what the Strawsonian worldview does is it starts with our everyday practices and then reasons within them as to what kinds of reactive attitudes and practices are justified. What the global skeptic is doing is questioning the whole desert system, the whole system of basic desert moral responsibility. And I give, again, very detailed arguments, that take up a huge portion of the book as to why the various traditional accounts, event causal accounts, agent causal libertarian accounts, deep self compatibilist accounts, reasons responsive accounts, all succumb to various types of objections. Again, so those are the reasons for why I want to do away with desert. That is, I don't think desert is justified. It's not because I do think this also, but I don't reject it because I think that adopting a system of desert leads to negative consequences. I think that is a secondary problem. I think it's a practical problem, even for the retributivist, even for one like you, and I give you a great deal of credit. I think you are, one of the few people that really spend a lot of time, and I think Berman Mitchell and some others are like this as well, playing up the forgiveness aspects and the mercy aspects and trying to come up with a reasonable retributivism that does avoid the extremes, but I still think that the fundamental underlying justification of the practice is philosophically unsound. That's my reason for rejecting it.
Sure.
Not because it leads to negative outcomes.
Sure. Let me just say so. You deny basic moral responsibility. That's what
Basically, there are other types of moral responsibility that are perfectly.
Yeah, correct. But the sense in which it could be ever good for anyone to get something because of something they did, but because of the cert, independently of any consequences, you deny that.
Yeah.
That puts a dent in morality, in a robust sense of morality. You're right that some things might survive. I don't think too many of them survive. But I want to mention, because you mentioned the bit about forgiveness, which you're right, it's a big, I'm very interested in the topic, and I think that punishment theory better pay much more attention to forgiveness theory. That is the crucial context, contest of values here. But one thing that would go off the board, if your thesis is correct, would be forgiveness. Because as a conceptual matter, we can only forgive that which we think deserves the punishment. This is well studied amongst forgiveness theorists. If, for example, you think I did something wrong, but then you find out that I was excused, or there's a mitigating circumstance, or a justification, or something along those lines, and therefore you forswear either resentment or punishment, in my interpretation, you are not forgiving me. You're excusing me. You are exonerating me, and so on and so forth. Forgiveness necessitates the cert. This is a crucial conceptual point. And I think that a world without forgiveness is also a bad world, just as a world without punishment, for different reasons, a whole different argument, but there is something important about the notion of the cert. And I wanted to say, just because you engage with a certain, and by the way, you do pay a lot of attention to this objection by Corrado to a certain potential danger with your position. And I remember, I think you do a very laudable, and I mean it, you deserve praise for the way you engage with the objection. You really deserve it. It's not consequentialist. There is a similar person who has an agenda similar to yours, Angela Davis, in her book on whether prisons are obsolete. She cites the also illuminating work of Lucia Zedner on prison for women. And it turns out that women in both American prisons and in prisons in the UK and in Europe were given much longer sentences than men in some cases. I mean, I don't have all the details with me, but the problem was that the assumption was they are not being punished, they are being treated. Something that gets lost in the shuffle of your view is that punishment, even in a bad criminal justice system, as we agree the US has, gives people protections, gives defendants protections.
Yeah,
the reason, by the way, this is consistent with doing much more harm than I am granting that point. But the reason, or the primordial reason why it is wrong that a woman who commits ex hypothesis the same crime as a man would spend longer time in prison because she needs to be treated for longer, to be retrained or trained. The fundamental reason is because she doesn't deserve that. So you need to appeal to the notion of the cert. One thing that I grant is this: there is so much that is bad with the criminal justice system in the US that you don't need the cert in order to mount an attack, such as the one you have mounted. There's so much wrong with it that you could pick other reasons why it should be radically transformed. But you do deprive yourself not only of one reason, the fact that it meets out so much undeserved punishment, but what many people have thought it is. Yeah, sure.
I mean, so there's a lot of things in there. I mean, one thing I would say is, and I make a case for this in the book, I have a whole chapter dedicated to this, that the purported protections of the proportionality principle and retributivism are more apparent than real. And that despite the fact that retributivists have always said that it provides these kind of protections against excessive force, it really doesn't. And the real core reason is that I call it the indeterminacy argument, that the judgments of both gravity and proportionality are so indeterminate, and I would say subjective and accessible to bias and prejudice, that ultimately they amount to nothing. They don't amount to true protection. I give real good cases of how that has played out historically in terms of what we think people deserve. And the reason why I think retributivists assume this theoretically, but in practice, I point out all the actual faults of how it works out. So I think that to preserve it because you think it's going to provide those protections, I think is misguided, because in essence, I think almost anything could be justified under the proportionality principle, given either a subjective movement in how we judge gravity or a subjective scaling of how we judge proportionality. And historically, homosexuality was considered a gravest wrong and punishable by death. We no longer consider it a wrong anymore at all. Intentional murder is pretty high on the ranking of gravity of wrongs, but retributivists disagree on what's proportional punishment. Kant says death is the only, fair response for murder. Other, more people like you who are more into forgiveness would say, no, death is too disproportionate. There's no actual ledger, right, that provides us with any objective kind of standard by which we could judge either both gravity or proportionality. So it doesn't really provide second, can I respond? Because you said a lot of things. Second, I would say that you still haven't addressed any of the arguments about why desert is unjustified. You just keep on pointing to why you think it's needed. I mean, even though I disagree fundamentally that it is, and I think everything that we really care about can be preserved without it. In fact, I think we'd be better off without it. You still have to confront the case of why you think it's justified to preserve it. And you're giving me consequentialist reasons, but you're not addressing the philosophical arguments as to whether or not the concept itself is philosophically sound. Let me add to one last thing on this. In terms of judgments of disparities in sentencing, are we running out of time?
No, but I just saw that Q&A is supposed to be happening too. I'm sorry.
All right, maybe we should open it up to Q&A instead. Yeah, let me open it up to Q&A.
Well, I'm sorry to break up the intense flow, and I really appreciate the way you both kind of didn't need to rely on a invigilator. You both kind of respectfully went back and forth. It was a very intense and enjoyable conversation. So I'm going to go on some of the questions. There are lots of questions that come in. I'll start with a very simple one from Joseph, and I guess this would be to you, Greg, because you used the phrase. Joseph asked, what is the public health quarantine model?
Yeah, okay. So the book is sort of broken down into two main parts with a transitional chapter. The first half is my arguments against retributivism. There's a transitional chapter where I address other alternative justifications of punishment, non-retributive ones like consequentialism, deterrence-based approaches, and I reject them for different reasons, not because of my skepticism. And then the second half is a development of the public health quarantine model. And the basic idea is to provide a non-retributive, in fact, in my view, a non-punitive approach to addressing criminal behavior. And that's what the public health quarantine model is. It has a quarantine component and a public health part. The quarantine part is building off of Dirk Pereboom's work. And essentially it runs something like this. If I were to, well, free will skeptics maintain that no one deserves punishment in the basic sense, not simply because no one is morally responsible in the basic desert sense. Nonetheless, if I were to contract Ebola, let's say I come to London to see Anthony in person or something, or you're not in London, I forgot, you're
Newcastle.
Newcastle. And I contract Ebola and I test positive at the airport. Well, I think everyone who's listening would agree that the state would be justified in quarantining me. That is limiting and constricting my liberty. And they could do so without appealing to basic desert. They could do so without appealing to just deserts or retribution or payback or free will or moral responsibility. The basic justification would be the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others. And so my argument is that we could give analogous incapacitation account for incapacitating seriously dangerous criminals, serial killers, child molesters, on a incapacitation account grounded in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we give for quarantine. However, the implications of that approach are radical, and I think Leo's right. Giving up desert and abandoning the traditional framework is a radical idea, and it requires radical changes. One of the big changes it requires is that the institutions that we incapacitate people in would not serve punitive purposes. Our prisons are punitive institutions. They used to be you hold people in prison until you could punish them. Now prisons are the punishment itself. And in my account, when you quarantine the Ebola patient or someone with a communicable disease, you're not punishing them despite the fact you're limiting their liberty. They have to maintain all their basic rights. You can't dehumanize them. You can't strip them of voting rights. And so on my account, the only right the individual loses is the right to liberty. The individual has to retain all their other basic rights. And then the focus of the criminal justice system should be rehabilitation and reintegration. So just like we quarantine the patient with Ebola, the state has an obligation to treat the person and then release them the minute they're no longer contagious. And so the same thing in the criminal context. The minute the individual poses no forward-looking threat to public safety, the state lacks any continued justification for incapacitating the wrongdoer. And so that's the basic idea of the quarantine part. The public health part is just, well, I don't say just because I think it's the key part. It shifts the focus away from this myopic obsession with punishment to prevention and social justice. So just like public health institutions, and I think this is where Leo and I could probably agree on a lot in terms of particular policy parts, is it's much better to prevent criminal behavior from occurring in the first place instead of punishing it on the tail end. But the public health framework gives us a way of identifying the social determinants of criminal behavior. I argue that the social determinants of criminal behavior are essentially identical to the social determinants of health. And so the public health framework is well suited for dealing with them. You identify them, you prioritize them, and then you adopt practices, best practices that are suited to address them. And one of the key aspects is social justice. So think of like infant mortality rates. Infant mortality rates, let's say in India or a developing country. One of the things you find is that's a poor health outcome. So public health institutions will go in and say, well, how do we address this high rate of child morbidity? And one of the things they often discover is the underlying health issues are driven by social justice inequities. In particular, in India, it might have to do with the fact of women's rights. Women lack reproductive control over their bodies. They don't have access to birth control. They don't always have primary decisions over how many children they have. Literacy rates are extremely low. So to address that poor health outcome, you have to address the social inequality, the underlying social injustice. And so my argument is that to reform the criminal justice system, you can't separate criminal justice reform from social justice because the social determinants of criminal behavior are largely driven by structural issues that have to do with social justice in the United States. And so I spell out a capabilities approach to social justice, which I argue is consistent with my free will skepticism, and argue that adopting this kind of preventative approach grounded in social justice and adopting the incapacitation account is more humane than retributivism, more effective than retributivism, and particularly given our conversation earlier, more justified than retributivism. So that's the basic idea, but it's spread out over like 5 chapters.
Okay, so there's quite a few questions that have come in that are specifically addressed to you, Leo. So there's 2 shorter ones right next to each other, which may dovetail or may be 2 separate answers, but I will put them both to you. So this is from Joseph, who asks, how do you think punishment would protect defendants, Leo? And Sean asks, how much role would Leo say intuition is playing in his defense of retributivism, if any at all? So it would be good to know what intuition would mean in this context. Do you want to take one or both of those, Leo?
I'll try to take both. I'll try to be brief. Regarding the question about how does punishment protect? Well, what affords defendants protections is that something is conceptualized as a punishment. The fact that you're getting suffering, it's a much more complicated story to tell as to how that is protecting you. But for example, just as I just had surgery on my hand 2 weeks ago for some problem with my finger, there is no moral notion as to what should happen to my finger, how long I should have the bandage on my hand. There is no moral discussion in this type of health problem that I had in my hand. But if I am being accused of having committed a crime, or even in the extra legal context, if a friend of mine thinks I've done something wrong, I have, even outside the institutional setting of the state, some sort of prerogative. I have a right to tell my story, to defend myself, to explain what I thought happened, to give further, context, and so on and so forth. It is in this way that to conceptualize something as a punishment offers protections. By the way, there is a certain, ambiguity or equivocation, because that's what I was trying to argue earlier against the public health quarantine model that Gregg defends, which is, if you conceptualize this as not a matter of punishment at all, you may lose some of these protections. Of course, Gregg wants to bring them back with its own sort of proportionality, but people like yours truly would think, well, but you cannot just take it away and put it back. That's a different story. So it is not even in this regard the anti-retributivist stance that is stripping people from some protections, but it's the anti-punitive, meaning ceasing to see these as a moral problem in a robust way, seeing it on par of the stitches on my hand. The other question, the role of intuitions. That's a very, very difficult question. What I'm going to give is a completely canned answer, but it's not false. I think most philosophers try to limit the role that intuitions play in their development of their theories. Whether one can fully succeed in doing that is a very dubious proposition. I don't think anyone can. In the book, I try to argue, I haven't convinced everyone, probably not even most people. I tried to argue why my appeal to intuitions is less problematic than other appeals, but I am not completely innocent of having some intuitions here. I would submit, neither is Gregg. I mean, we all have in some way an intuition in the background. Ideally, we wouldn't, and I think some theories are better than others because they rely less, crucially on intuition. So they rely on set of interlocking intuitions or something along those lines. But those are both very good questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Leo. So I'll turn the next question to Gregg. I guess we'll have to try and keep answers reasonably short, even if they're not the kind of questions that deserve short answers. It's just one of the unfortunate things about just having an hour. So this is a question from Matt, who asks, does retributivism have to suppose, quote, basic desert? The issue is not always about where the basic desert exists, but where the basic desert, rather than, say, responsibility as answerability, is necessary for all forms of retributivism. Do you want to dig into that one, Gregg?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. You have to get into distinguishing all the various types of accounts of responsibility. The question mentioned answerability, but the more contentious notion, the one that is typically thought to involve basic desert, is accountability. Answerability, I argue, and this follows Dirk Piraboom, understood in a certain kind of way, answerability responsibility is consistent with the rejection of basic desert, and so consistent with free will skepticism. Answerability is the kind of sort of moral exchange I was alluding to earlier, where you ask a wrongdoer, why did they act as they acted? What were the reasons for why they acted? Maybe they could identify a flaw in themselves. Maybe they could acknowledge a a willingness to try to work on that aspect of themselves moving forward. The idea of answerability, as Dirk Pirobum develops it, is that it's grounded not in the notion of desert or in basic desert, but in three non-desert deseratum: future protection, future moral formation, and future safety. That kind of moral exchange or conversational approach, I argue, is consistent with the rejection of free will. The retributivist approach requires a notion of basic desert that, and I'm not sure if Leo agrees or not, I think he does in this book, yeah, is that the punishment is somehow intrinsically good. Good without reference to any other goods that might arise, i.e. good in a non-instrumentalist way. That, I argue, does require a notion of basic desert.
Okay, thank you, Greg. We'll just have a couple more quick questions and then we'll finish. This is a question from Tonya, and I'll put it to Leo. Tonya wonders whether there is any harm done to the retributor by retribution. So I suppose the question is both, do you think there is harm done to the one who engages in retribution? And is this the kind of thing that should be taken into account when sort of rolling out the theory?
I am not sure I understand the question.
I guess the way I understand it is something like the idea that those who may engage in retributive acts may themselves be harmed in the process of doing it. It kind of maybe corrupts their soul. That's what I take. It may not be the question, but let's assume it is.
Taking it in that way, I actually think is a very profound question and very complex, because I think a particularly eager character when it comes to meting out punishment, even if deserved, is a worrying sight. So I'm not, it would contradict my central view to say that I lament when people get what they deserve. I don't. But there is an important question to be asked as to this sort of ease to do that sort of thing. And incidentally, in my work, I try to, that's part of my reason for turning to the importance of forgiveness. It's not, I am not I'm not a punitive person, I'm not stern, but I do believe that a moral universe without the idea of basic desert, not only for suffering, but for pleasant things. Just very, very quickly, imagine Gregg wins an award for this book, which I can say he would deserve. He cannot say that himself, but I think he deserves it. And he's gonna get a medal. And let's suppose I want to be there to witness that moment. There's something perfectly fine about that. He deserves it. He will get the award. It would be beautiful to share this moment. Contrast what for me is a possibility and is the opposite. Someone commits a crime and they're gonna get a punishment. For me to want to witness that moment, which is deserved in this example, there's something disturbing about that. So there is an asymmetry, even for someone like me who believes in desert. There is something worrying, problematic. Maybe that's the way, Anthony, you explained the question. That is a very, very profound question. I don't think that we should, once someone told me that even if I'm right, wouldn't the world be better if people didn't think I was right? Maybe, but I'm doing philosophy, but I think the question is profound, is very profound, yes.
Okay, well, I'm sure Tonya, who's one of my friends, will be delighted to hear that you think her question is profound, because I think sometimes she feels they're misunderstood by people. So thanks for a great answer, Leo. As we should probably draw to an end, I thought I'd give Greg the last word, couple of minutes, if you want to just make any final comments, if you have anything you feel has been left unsaid.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you both, Anthony, for organizing this, the Philosopher magazine, and Leo. And I look forward to the print exchange as well. Maybe it's best to sort of focus on a few things of agreement, because I think we focus a lot. I do think, Leo, and it came out a lot in the last question, does a good job bringing out the paradoxical nature, I think, as you frame it, of punishment and retribution, because you see forgiveness as having an equal kind of value as giving individuals, wrongdoers, their desert. And so you have a kind of lamentable aspect, as you just sort of articulated. I think we both agree the world would be a little bit better with less punitive responses to crime. I will say that I do still think fundamentally that the notion of free will and basic desert do more harm than good. And so part of what I feel is that by abandoning the belief in free will, and particularly abandoning what I think is the pernicious notion of just deserts, we could look more deeply into the systems that shape individuals and their behavior, and adopt what I would consider more humane, more effective practices and policies. I wish I had more time to talk about the public health part of my framework, because I do think that's in a way one of the novel contributions of the book, in that I owe you an account to what do I do with a serial killer, right? Because that's what everyone wants to know from the free will skeptic. Well, what do you do? And so that's what the incapacitation part of my account is there for. But I do think, and maybe Leo agrees, we're an excessively punitive society, and we're obsessed with this idea of giving wrongdoers, their just deserts. And so I think that what we need to do is sort of shift the focus to prevention and social justice, and policy in particular. I lay a lot of policy proposals in the book for how to implement a public health approach. One of the things, though, that I still think is overlooked, and it's one of those things that is one of the big disagreements between me and Leo, is the role that free will plays, the belief in free will. I think the belief in free will keeps alive the notion that individuals deserve certain types of praise and blame. And I think when the focus is always on individual responsibility, it's like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you view wrongdoing and and the opposite, praiseworthy acts, through the lens of wholly individual responsibility, then your responses are punitive, tend to be punitive. What I argue is that that's a sort of time slice approach to individuals, especially the way it works in the legal system. Did the individual has mens rea? Were they competent? Yes, yes. You check off all the things. Did they satisfy the compatibilist conditions for free will? Yes. Then they deserve a certain type of punishment. But what I want to adopt is a holistic approach, a whole person approach that sees individuals as embedded in social systems and frameworks. And once you do that, and I wish we had talked more about the role of luck in my reasons for rejecting free will based on luck. But when you look at criminality, one of the remarkable things is that the lives of individuals in prison are filled with hardship and abuse. There is no clear black and white line between perpetrator and victim. In fact, statistically, and I argue this in the book, the vast majority of criminals were themselves victimized in the past. Over 90%, or I think it's close to 90%, of women in prison in the United States have been victims of abuse, either rape, sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence. We know then that the exposure to violence is a criminogenic intervention. That is, it leads to criminal involvement in the criminal justice system for various reasons. Women who are abused tend to have higher rates of unemployment. They have the psychological effects of abuse make it more difficult for them to hold a job. As a result, they get involved in higher rates of incarceration. We know that the vast majority of people in the United States who are in prison suffer from mental illness. Over 50% of people in prisons have a diagnosable mental illness. They would be better served with mental health treatment. Underlying drug addiction is a big driver for mass incarceration. Most of these people don't deserve incarceration. They deserve some sort of drug treatment. And so when you look at criminal behavior, it's more a byproduct of circumstances than people. And if you look at, there for the grace of God go I, right? But there for the grace of luck go I, that if I were thrown into certain situations with these social determinants of criminal behavior, poverty, low socioeconomic status, high rates of unemployment and lack of access to healthcare, low nutrition and poor environmental health, education, identify a bunch in the book. If you're thrown into those unlucky circumstances, you're more likely statistically to get involved in the criminal justice system. And there are certain types of determinants that are even more correlated. Poverty and low socioeconomic status is the greatest correlate with incarceration. When you view everything through desert and individual responsibility, you fail to see things systemically in this way. You don't want to acknowledge the causes, in part because it diminishes the focus on individual responsibility. So part of my fear is that by keeping the belief in free will alive and the notion of just deserts alive, we stop people from identifying the real causes of criminal behavior, and therefore prevent the kind of policies that would be most effective in preventing criminal behavior in the first place. So my hope is that in the book, I develop what is a viable alternative and ethically defensible alternative, and one I hope is less problematic than retributivism, but we'll have to wait for another day to get further into this.